Welcome to this 2023 edition of my Blind Amp Shootout series, and each time I do this, I go bigger, and today is no exception. I've got quite the array of amps. I've got this beautiful VHT Deliverance 120. This is an old VHT that's worth about $2,000. I've got the crate that is, I picked up for $80. This is an old 90s solid-state head. Cool amp, but very different price range. And then I've got my Laney IRT Studio, and this I picked up for about $350 used many years ago, but these would run for maybe about $700 or so. They're all three different amps, obviously two tube, one solid state, and two very different wattages of tube amps. And then I also ran the Crown from Audio Assault, which is today's amp sim, and it's one of my favorite plugins from them. You can pick that up for maybe about $15, depending on whatever crazy sales they've got going on. I was very careful not to move the cab or the mics, so none of that is going to affect things, just the different amps. When I first started this series, I wanted to prove that amp sims had massively evolved over the years, going back to the old Poulin stuff from around 2009 that was put out for free, still is free, all the way up to, neural DSP plugins that go for a lot more money and are, generally considered maybe sort of top of the line for amp sims, certainly up there with any of the other best amp sims. And what I found in that was that I could basically dial in all the amp sims, whether they were free or cheap, from different companies, different eras, basically dial them all in to sound very similar to each other. And no one really guessed them right. And people's favorites were kind of all over the board. In fact, many preferred the old Poulin stuff, and very few people seem to prefer the Neural DSP. Don't know why. In the second video, I threw in the Laney as a tube amp to see if tubes versus amp sims, if there was some big noticeable difference in quality, sound, something. And again, most people didn't really guess it right. Not everyone preferred, in fact, many people did not prefer the tube amp. And so once again, it didn't seem like there was anything magical about a real tube amp compared to amp sims, at least not in my demos. And so here we are with a whole bunch of really expensive gear, expensive hardware versus an amp sim, though the amp sim is just one of four. And it's really also tubes versus solid state and big tube amp versus little tube amp. The recording setup today, I've got the SM57 on the cap edge of this 412. It's carbon 412 with V30s. This is on the edge of the dust cap. And then I've got my modded MXL 990 with a upgraded capsule. It's a nice sounding mic now. And that is on the cone just to blend in some of that extra thickness and fill in some of the things that the 57 doesn't have. They all have the exact same blend. There's no post-processing. They're all running through the cab live, though I did shoot an IR while I was at it, and I will put out all these multi-tracks on my Discord. If you want to play around with them, I'll release, everything I have in this session, so all of the recorded tracks as well as the DIs, as well as the IR, so you can use that exact same IR and try out different amps if you want to try to match them up yourself and see how good you can do with that. So down in the comments, I want you to guess which amp you think is which, as well as which one is your favorite. We'll see if any of you can really get it right this time. I doubt it. In this next clip, I have more of a real-world scenario where I've added some drums, no bass, just drums and guitars. I've also added a touch of corrective EQ with the stock Reaper EQ, and most of these moves are within 1 or 2 dB because they're all pretty close as is. And this is something you'd have access to if you were mixing. So while it may not be built into the amps, it's certainly something that matters when recording. And the question is, does the difference in quality of these amps, do they sound really different when you have access to a little bit of EQ and in the context of a mix? I could maybe get the amps a little bit closer with just the EQ on there, but they don't necessarily have the same frequencies, the same Q values. Obviously, the EQ circuit is going to affect things, but I would say the EQ circuit is almost different from the tubes and the gain quality, or tubes versus solid state versus DSP. I think of the EQ component as a very important one in amp voicing, but also somewhat separate to the more fundamental component of what kind of tubes does it have, and how many, and are there tubes, and is it a real amp or a sim? I've also always wondered how my little Laney is going to stack up against a bigger amp, because most 50 or 100 watt amps have 4 preamp tubes, and this one only has 3 preamp tubes. So does that drastically change the quality of distortion? Does it sound thinner, or maybe it has less gain? I don't know. They're all kind of dialed in pretty similar with the gain knobs, actually. And it also has 2 EL84 power amp tubes. So it's a lower wattage and they're smaller tubes, and different power amp tube types do sound somewhat different. You can see in this next demo how much of a difference it makes. So I think all of those came out really close. I think the standout was the crate, which didn't surprise me. I figured that was going to be the most different. I think between the EQ and the solid state-ness of that amp, it stood out more than even the amp sim. I think with the extra post EQ, they got very close. But the crate is definitely a 90s death metal kind of sounding amp. It sounds like kind of a distortion pedal. But with the extra EQ and with how I dialed it in, I think it did hang with the tube amps fine. I don't think it sticks out like a sore thumb, but it definitely is the most different of them. So, what are the results? A is my Laney. B is the crate. C is the VHT Deliverance, and D was the Crown by Audio Assault. Did you get it right? Are you shocked by the results? Let me know in the comments. I thought it was not entirely surprising to me. I figured that the crate would be the most different, and it was. As far as amp settings, I set the VHT basically the same way I would set up most amp sims. I've got bass, middle, and treble all around 6. I've got the gain up most of the way because I'm not using a boost pedal, and normally I would throw in a tube screamer and a noise gate first, but I didn't want to use any pedals, just keep the signal chain pure. So I've got the presence boosted tiny bit. I've got the depth rolled off a little bit so it doesn't get too flubby. And this one also has a crisp and thick voicing knob, and it's about 60% to the thick side because we like them thick here. This amp has always been, to me, I think kind of dark, and today was no different. On the crate, the high is at 0. And when I did a video with the crate, I had the bass and highs right at 5. I had the shape right around 5 or 6. But compared to the Deliverance, it was so bright and so scooped and just completely did not sound like at all the same. So I completely removed the highs. I also have the shape right about 1, so that's almost all the way low. And the shape knob kind of boosts mids when it's low, and it's like the opposite of a mid scoop. So obviously, even with it at noon, it was way more scooped sounding than the VHT. So I basically made it all a mid boost, and even then, it's very bright and scooped compared to the others. I got it pretty close, I think, but if you want this thing to sound like a boutique tube amp, I guess you have to just put the shape and the highs to basically 0. And then the lows are at about 4, and the gain is also about 75%, about 7.5 on the dial. On the Laney, I've got the bass at 6, the mids at 4, and the treble at 6. And this doesn't have a presence knob on it. It does have a master tone knob, which is at noon, and a dynamics knob, which kind of boosts your chugs, kind of boosts the bass on palm mutes, basically, and that's at about 6. And the gain is at 8.5. So this one is slightly lower gain than the others, and it was most similar in terms of EQ to the VHT. On the Crown, the amp sim, I also lowered the presence and the treble to about 3 on each of those, which is much lower than I normally would on my mixes. I would usually put them at about 6 or so, kind of like I set up the VHT. Again, I had to darken that one up a lot, and it's a little bit surprising, and I don't know how much of that is the VHT being a dark amp and how much of that is things like solid state and amp sims being brighter than tube amps. I can't really tell you, but what I do know is that I had to roll off the treble on those. I didn't really on the Ironheart. On the Ironheart, I was able to put the settings pretty close to where they are on the VHT, so that's also interesting. And Ironheart I've always thought is kind of mid-focused and not a super bright amp either. So that's another thing I've noticed. I wonder if tube amps are generally darker than solid-state amps, than amp sims are often set up. I mean, amp sims can vary. You could make it darker by default, and, you know, knob position kind of doesn't really matter. It's all sort of arbitrary, but it's just interesting. And maybe if you're struggling to get a tube-like tone from your amp sims, maybe roll off some of that presence and treble. And I often sometimes roll down the presence if they're too spiky, and sometimes, depending on the IR, depending on the mix, they can be. So what have we learned? All amps sound different, but if you take the time, you can make them sound mostly the same. And I already knew that. I've already demonstrated that. But yet again, I think, is there a massive difference in the sort of gain quality and the texture and the, I don't know, is there some sort of extra specialness about a boutique tube amp? You know, maybe. But I didn't really notice that the gain, I thought, necessarily sounded better than the others. It might have been a little higher or lower than the others. Again, I'm dialing them in by ear. But I didn't really think that it necessarily sounded better than the others, but it was the benchmark because it's the expensive boy here. And, you know, so that was kind of my measuring stick was the VHT. I think it's a great sounding amp, you know, but do you need it? No, you know, I don't think so. No, I think amp sims do the job just great, and they're so convenient and so cheap that I love it. I support, simulating your amps, but having real amps is of course fun, and having the wattage in a live scenario is necessary. So things like this cheap crate can be great, you know, especially if you want a really brutal old school death metal tone. The crate does that way better than the VHT. It like kind of always does that to some degree. And that's definitely something different. I would kind of like to see more solid state based amp sims, because I think they're kind of neglected in favor of the boutique stuff, but I really like the old solid state stuff too. I think it's fun. I think it's different. Not that all tube amps sound the same, but they have a similar quality, and solid state amps can really range a lot. I mean, there's kind of fuzzy solid state amps. There's very distortion pedal-esque solid state amps. There's super scooped and crisp solid state amps that just do things that tube amps really can't. There's a lot of options there, a lot of different kind of solid state tones you can get, and a lot of modern, you know, small pedal board style solid state amps that are really great and might sound tube-like enough. So it was a fun demo. I'm glad I got to hear them all side by side. I've kind of been thinking about this for a little while, and it's good to actually do it and hear it. And it's a lot of work to put together. So I hope you enjoy it, and, you know, smash like and subscribe, and you can check out the multi-tracks for this on my Discord, as well as a number of free IRs. And I hope to see you there. And I hope you stick around, and I'll see you in the next video.